So my fifth grade teacher was named Miss Niblick, and she had this idea when we were studying homonyms, which are when two words are spelled differently but sound alike, that we should have a homonym spell down in our class. One of those terrible things where one person wins and everybody else loses, like a spelling bee. And I assumed I would be the person to win it because I was a good student. And I had been working at home with my mother on drilling my homonyms. Sleigh for sleigh, slew for slew, all of those things. But there was a new kid in our class. I don't know really where he came from. I never found that out. His name was Chris Tosco. He was the shrimpy little kid with a crew cut and big goggly glasses and a squeaky voice, and nobody really liked him. And one day when I was in the playground, he came up to me and said, "How about that homonym spell down?" He said he'd been studying for it really hard, and he was intending to win. He was going to beat me. And I looked down at him and I said, I didn't know what I said. I just thought, no way. You don't understand. So the day comes along, and it plays out just about like you'd expect, where it was good, and Chris was actually surprisingly good. So one after another, kids blew it and sat down, having lost, but they had a lot of company, until eventually it was just Chris and me left. And Chris got this word, liar, which is a word I had an interesting relationship myself with at that young age. I was something of a liar myself. And he started, and he thought, and he came out with L-I, and I immediately knew that I had won, because I knew what the word was that Miss Niblick was looking for. And after, terrible thought, he came out with E-R. And she said, "Sorry, Chris, that's not a word." And I leaped to my feet and said, L-Y-R-E, liar. It's a musical instrument. I was so excited to have won that I didn't realize that Chris was having a meltdown. He kept insisting that liar was a word, and I said, and I went and got the dictionary and opened it up and showed him no L-I-E-R in our dictionary. But he started to cry, went red in the face, and kept saying, "It is a word, it is a word." And I somehow was involved in the scene, and we both ended up getting sent to the principal. Where there was this gigantic dictionary about the size of Chris Tosco. And Chris opened it up, flipped the L's. Sure enough, L-I-E-R, one who lies as an ambush. So immediately, the principal, a very nice man, declared us both winners. Game over. Which I thought was rather unfair, because if we'd gone another round, I was sure I would have killed the guy. But I was magnanimous in semi-victory. So a few weeks later, school let out, and I came back from day camp one day and found my mother crying in the kitchen with the news that Chris Tosco had been killed by a car on Grant Road, where he and his mother lived. And I didn't really know much about death at that point. Didn't know what to think about it, but I knew that I'd had these kind of homicidal feelings toward him, and I just felt incredibly guilty. And my mother said, "Well, you have to write his mother a condolence note," which is one of the first really, really onerous tasks I think I ever experienced as a child. So I wrote some kind of note, sent it off. So 30 years later, I'm writing an essay about Charles Schulz and my own relationship with peanuts, and I'm talking about the sense of guilt that Charlie Brown has and that I identify with. So I tell this story. I tell the whole homonym story, which I just sort of borrowed from my own work to do here. I've used up a lot of my stories for the writing, right? At least the good ones. And of course, one of the terrible things that fact checkers at the New Yorker, which was publishing this article, this essay, what they have to do is they have to call up the relatives of people who have died and that the writer has written about. So some poor young fact checker had to call up Mrs. Tosco, who was still on Grant Road in St. Louis, and confirm the details. And he did this, and came back with the news that Mrs. Tosco remembered me, indeed had been feeling guilty for 30 years because she had never thanked me for my condolence note, which had meant so much to her, which my mother had made me write. And she also, it turned out to be, she was having a hard life. One of her other children had also died in childhood and had become very religious. Okay, so the piece came out, and about 3 weeks after the piece came out, a letter comes in the mail. It's a rather thick envelope from Mrs. Tosco, and I'm so averse to people being mad at me that I could really not open it myself. So my spouse equivalent, Kathy, agreed to open it for me. And we sort of looked at the first page, and it seemed, and she was talking about how guilty she'd always felt, never to have replied to my condolence letter. But then she went on to talk about what a terrible amount of pain my piece had caused her. And it was not that I'd gotten anything wrong. She was somewhat hurt that she had one image of this, by the way, important fact, I'm not reading it. I can't bear to read it because I can't stand to have people mad at me. So poor Kathy is basically paraphrasing this. So I'm working off a paraphrase here. The really terribly painful thing about reading this piece was that it had become my story. It was no longer, something that had been her story was being told by me, and it was being told through the filter of myself, which is what a writer does, right? And yet, to have such an incredibly central, meaningful story appear as basically one column in a New Yorker piece, kind of about, well, very much about somebody else, that was a terribly, terribly painful experience. Kathy put the letter back in the envelope. I took the envelope, resolving not to look at it myself because I did not want to see the words. So some more time goes by, and it's Penn World Voices Festival, and they're doing this Moth thing, and I love Penn. They're a great organization. Find out more about them and their excellent work. I'm trying to think of the story, and you meet with the producer if you do the Moth. So we had coffee, and everything went swimmingly until I got to the end where I started to do this kind of essayistic thing where I was interpreting how terrible it is to have your story taken away from you. And kind of summing up, and it was like, no, that's kind of a Moth no-no. You really need to keep the story going all the way to the end. So I said, okay, I promise I'll go home and think about how to do that. So I did not for a few days. But one night in the shower, it occurred to me, I know what to do. I'm going to dig that letter out, and I'm going to read it. And I'm going to tell you about what the letter actually says rather than this paraphrase. So it was great. I just kind of put the whole thing on a shelf mentally, and that was maybe 5 weeks ago we had this meeting. And the weeks go by, and I'm thinking, you really ought to dig that letter out from the box at the office where it is. And finally, this last Monday, I could put it off no longer. I had to see if it was in that box, and sure enough, it was in a folder in there. So I put it on the desk. Must read this. Maybe some evening after I've had a drink. So Monday became Tuesday, Tuesday became Wednesday, Wednesday became Thursday, Thursday became yesterday. And I kept thinking, well, I'll do it tomorrow. Because I was just doing what a writer does, right? I was telling a story, trying to make sense of my life and passing it along. in hopes that it might resonate with other people, and that there was, there's sort of an exchange of gifts going on here, and that's, it's my job to give gifts like that. And yet, in that envelope was somebody's painful report on the price of seizing control of the story. And I just didn't want to read those words. So there was always today, however. So I went to the office this morning. I was scheduled to talk on the phone with the Moth at noon. And, I just kind of watched the hands on the watch go around, and it got to be noon and still couldn't look at the letter. And then basically spent the whole afternoon thinking, still have time, still have time. And at a certain point, I realized I'm not going to look at it. It's here, and it's a report, and I want to show the letter out of respect to Mrs. Tosco, but also out of an inescapable shame of being a storyteller, of taking control of the story like that. And I really don't know what went wrong. Thank you.